final panel of the day, predictions. I think in order to think about where we're going, sometimes we have to think about where we are. So maybe just as a way of kind of introducing our esteemed panelists, we'll go around and talk about their unique perspective coming from their organizations and their personal life in terms of, what we've seen in the past few years and where we're headed. Rob, maybe we'll start with you. Coming out of a traditional higher education institution, where we think of innovation in many different ways, I'm kind of curious to learn more about the role of the faculty member in inspiring innovation.
Well, when you think about faculty and innovation, sometimes it's a non-starter, right? It's a non sequitur. But I think looking at the role of faculty in innovation within higher education really forces you to consider how higher ed is really this transition from something that was invented at a very different time and place for something different, being transitioned into something different, whether it's more oriented on professional outcomes, whether it's more focused on meeting students where they are. The challenge is how do you get faculty, how do you get academic learning, how do you unpack those things to do something different? And in the case of faculty, there's a lot of resistance to do so. So I know with technology and educational technology, the opportunity to do teaching and learning in very different ways and great sources of content and so forth. Question for me really is, can you do any of that without changing the way faculty think about what they do? And at my institution, that's what we're focused on doing and trying to implement an adaptive learning pathway is to really unpack the role of faculty, put it back together in such a way that it works to support a different kind of pathway.
Cool, great, thanks. Hey, Steve, you're in a little bit of an interesting position on this panel, coming from both K-12 and higher ed at Hobsons. I'm curious to know why are we trying to transform education? I mean, we got into this a little bit on the last panel in terms of what is the ultimate outcome that we should be thinking about as we're looking at tech innovation headed in the future?
Yeah, I think that's, generally it's not just about ed tech, it's about education. We talk a lot about outcomes, and we say that we want to improve outcomes. I think one of the things that's challenging, though, is that we're not very specific about what we mean when we are trying to measure an outcome. An outcome is a test score, an outcome is a graduation rate, an outcome is persistence or retention rates, an outcome is a job. And I think because we're so not specific about what we are trying to measure, it's very hard for us to get consensus about whether we're doing a good or a bad job at achieving those objectives. And so, when we think about what we're trying to do at Hobsons, it's really about helping students get the most out of their education. And I think about 25 years ago when I was an undergraduate, and I wrote this impassioned thesis about learning for learning's sake. But I think with the benefit of hindsight, there's nothing wrong with learning for learning's sake, but there's a recognition now 25 years on that an awful lot of students are going to school because they expect it to do something for them from a career standpoint. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think if we put that up front and we recognize that it's one of many things that we're trying to accomplish, but just like a business is trying to accomplish a lot of things for its end stakeholders, but it's also going to measure its revenue and profitability. I don't think it should be off the table to measure the gainful employment of students when they graduate.
Great. Robin, you're coming from another unique perspective here because, in the past 50, 60 years, there have not been very many attempts to really create a new elite four-year undergraduate accredited institution from scratch. When you're thinking about this, really with higher education having a history that, we're dealing with institutions that have largely not changed in the last 400 years. What are you thinking about when you're going ahead and starting this from scratch? What are the types of things that Minerva's looking at?
So let me ask a question of this group. When you hear about a new university, how many of you think we need another new university? Right? There are 4,000, well, thank you, there's one. But you know that there are thousands and thousands of universities and higher education opportunities for students, but there's still a miss. And we looked at it as in these ways, right? So first off, there are incredibly talented students around the world who are hungering to get into a top institution, and there just aren't enough seats. Those who get in pay about $250,000 for the privilege of going for 4 years, and when they graduate, they're not ready to take the jobs that are out there. So there's something that is terribly wrong. So when we looked at, is there a need for another institution? Yes, if you can create an institution that is accessible and affordable and that truly prepares the students to go make a difference in the world when they graduate. So, taking on the task of reimagining from the ground up means thinking of everything. So we had to think about what skills do they need when they graduate, what are the things they have to be able to do, and starting to think about not just from a what is their major and what's the functional skill, but how do we truly teach them to think. So at Minerva, we've thought about what are the foundational things that will help prepare them to be leaders and innovators, and it comes down to three things, and employers have verified these are the things they're looking for: critical thinking, creative thinking, and effective communication. And that's easy to say, but then you have to break it down further to something that's measurable. And so we've taken the next step to break it down to 129 foundational concepts and habits of mind.
But only 129.
Just 129 that we track during the lifetime of the student. So, it's really rethinking what the education should provide and what the student should come out with at the end. And then just briefly, I think it's important to think about, it's not just about what happens in a classroom, but the whole experience, because a university experience is about community, it's about all of the other experiential components, and we've rethought that as well. And we think it's better to get a global experience than to be sitting on a campus in one city for 4 years. So as part of our rethink, it's really about students moving throughout the world during the course of their 4 years.
Cool. Maybe while we're on the topic of new within education, we can go over to Bill, because Bill, you have a pretty interesting background. You come out of the Army, you work for the CIO there in a senior role. You've done some work in training. You've led technology companies. You've become the CEO of Symplicity this year. You're really the relative newcomer on this panel when it comes to working in traditional education. What surprised you?
Probably what surprised me most at Symplicity, we've got three major markets, higher education being one of them. And coming in, I expected to find the colleges and universities to be the leading edge, leading thought of what the future should look like. And my last 10 years as a general officer on the training side with the Army, we were doing both what you would call vocational skills level training all the way up to master's level education for 17 to 40-year-olds. I would have expected that what we were providing as far as software as a service on the recruiting, the retention, the quality of life, and the career service for students at colleges and universities to be the leading edge. In fact, what I find out is that the Army is so far ahead and is truly more of the thought leader that I'm stunned, shock and awe. How could something as bureaucratic as the government actually be answering a question that many of you are asking today? How can we do this? What is the future? Should we be adaptive? What are we looking for? The Army's been doing it for 15 years. So why are we trying to reinvent the wheel?
Cool. All right, Isaac, you're coming at this from Adobe, where you work in higher education technology. You're very involved in a new computer science high school. Are we ready for an ed tech revolution? Is this something that can happen?
I think contrary to traditional thinking, I think that yes. I don't think that it's a state of being ready as far as, okay, now we're ready to go do this, right? It's more about where we're at from a civilization perspective. And we tend to think of technology as a mechanism for change, but my experience has actually been that it's not a mechanism for change, but it's the catalyst for change, right? So as technologies evolve, most of you are familiar with Moore's Law, right? An oversimplification of Moore's Law is that every 2 years, technology gets twice as good. Okay? That's an oversimplification, but that's basically the idea. Well, as that technology increases and it gets better, our expectations go up as well. Most of you in this audience can probably remember an ISDN line back in the day. Remember how fast an ISDN line was? 128K, right? 128K, that was lightning fast. Now if we're in public transport and we can't watch an HD video, or if we're at the top of the Himalayas taking pictures and we can't instantly post them to Instagram, we have to wait till we get back to the hotel, we're disappointed. Okay? There's an expectation that comes along with it. And so basically, the advancement of technology is a function, and our expectation is a product of that function. So looking at it from that perspective, I work at Adobe in the digital publishing space, and I've seen the tools for authoring get much, much more simple. Okay? And I believe that we're close to an age now where instead of us consuming content, instead of us wondering, go buy this textbook or go do this online course, it's starting to turn into simpler creation. And that is a sea change. Nathan and I talked about this ahead of time. It's a sea change that happens. So when you get back to the idea of it being a function and a product of that function, it really doesn't matter what our opinion is, right? Oh, yes, there are things that are going to stand in the way, but when a sea change happens, it happens. And I believe that sea change is there, and I believe that we're ready for it, even though we're not consciously, actively seeking it, although some of us are. It's going to happen.
And that's actually a really good transition to our final panelist introduction, and Nathan Schultz, who's the Chief Learning Officer at CHAG. And Nathan, we hear a lot about education, we hear a lot about technology, we hear a lot about institutions, but, and Isaac was starting to say that the expectations are shifting. What role does the student play in the future of the EdTech revolution?
Yeah, I mean, this is the topic we were talking about earlier around disruption, and my response to disruption was it all depends on really who's listening, because it's the students that are driving the disruption, not companies like CHAG, although we think we are, and we believe we do great things. Not universities, they're also very important in the value chain, but it is absolutely the student who is pulling us into this world, and it depends on who's listening the hardest. And so that's the thing that we try every single day as we build new tools, either it be a better way to get a textbook, a better way to get a tutor, a better way to get self-directed learning tools. We're always listening to the student day in and day out, because they really have to be the center of our universe for us to really say that we're educating the masses. So
Cool.
we think of them as very, very important.
Awesome. Now we get to go into the fun portion of the panel and really start to have a conversation about what's coming in the future and thinking this year and beyond. And actually, I'll take a quick poll of the audience, just using your hands. 3 years ago, how many of you would have thought that the MOOC was going to disrupt education? That's it? Come on, be honest.
Be honest.
How many people thought that it would have put out of business higher education institutions?
I did.
I did, for sure.
Yeah. How many articles did you get every week from EdSurge about MOOCs?
Time
Right?
Magazine.
Everyone got them.
Everybody was saying hundreds, thousands of institutions won't exist in the future because there'll be MOOCs. That didn't happen, as we all know. Completion rates suffered. But 3 years ago, you would have thought it. So how do you actually disrupt education? Can you do it from the outside? Is there going to be one sort of technology innovation or change that's going to come out there and say, we're going to do this whole thing differently? Or does it have to come from within?
Kind of, building off what Robin and Nathan both made reference to, we've got students that are now walking out with $250,000 debt that they are not able to pay off for years. You've got industry saying that what you're sending to us is not qualified for what we need as societal, needs right now. So I agree with Nathan. The push is going to be that the student, who is really the customer that we all need to be focused on, they're standing up saying, universities, institutions, you're failing me because I cannot continue post-graduation. And yet I think we're missing and we're ignoring them right now. So that's where the disruption is going to come, where they have the revolution saying, stop.
Yeah, to me, there's a disconnect, a generational disconnect between our educators and our students. And the kids who are in school now, they never paid for music, right? And they get video in a very different way. If we don't listen to that and kind of use that as the focus of how we're going to build our education tools and the offerings we're going to give to kids, then we're going to be missing this mark. We're going to have to.
By the way, real quick, I just want to point out a little stat. The freshman entering college this fall will be born in 1997.
Yeah.
So think about that.
Yep.
Yeah, and it all comes down to, again, to that expectation and consumerism. On the last panel, I wrote this down. Howard Tillman said, things that are working and that we take for granted in other industries will find their way into education. And that is no more, it's the truest when it comes to consumerism, right? We expect things to be, when we order something off of Amazon, we expect it to be there in 2 days. We expect it to be exactly what we want it to be, right? That's the consumer age that we live in. And education and education technology methodologies are not exempt from that.
No, they're not, but I'd take a slightly contrarian view on this, which is to think, rather than with a very broad brush about education, to think about K-12 and higher ed, at least in this case, pretty differently. And the reason for that being that, you know, we spend $600 billion in K-12 education, there's 100 and whatever thousand schools in the United States. There is no political movement to shutter schools.
Right.
So what you're going to have is students, 60 million of them, are going to go to school in America, largely in fixed buildings, and that's going to happen for a very long time to come. So when you talk about disruption in K-12, I think it's in a very different context. So that's, in higher ed, I think you've got a lot more potential for, you know, fundamental change in the model, because it's not compulsory, because a lot of it's driven by tuition payments, and there is more of a sense of consumer choice. So I just wanted to make that.
Very fair. I would just piggyback on that, though. I think, you know, I'm all for disruption in the higher ed space, but I think there are two things. One is, does it have to happen through the current institutions? The answer to that is probably yes. One thing that might change is that a lot of those institutions go out of business, and it creates an opening, right? Because one of the things that's really under the radar, I think, for a lot of folks who don't follow higher ed closely is the failing business model of most institutions under the elite level. You saw something in the last couple of years that I think opens people's eyes a little bit. What's happened to law schools in the last 3 years, just how precipitous the drop of law schools has been. Nobody saw that coming, and that may be something that will come for the industry as a whole. But the other thing is that if the change, the disruption is going to have to take place through conventional institutions, these are institutions that are faculty-centric, right? The number one value of the accreditors that keeps these organizations in business is faculty governance. These are institutions that are in many ways employee-owned. So in order for real disruption to take place in the space, you're going to have to see changing fundamental assumptions about what faculty do, what these institutions are about. And I've been thinking that disruption will be coming for quite some time, since the 90s when I started. It's always pushed into the future, and I think if you compare where we are today with where we were in the 90s on most campuses, it's not that different than you would think.
I think that puts us in a dangerous place, though. Right? That means that evolution is glacial. It's not happening fast enough.
And real quick, just Robin, I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on this from a faculty perspective and somebody who just went through the process of getting accreditation, you know, in the year 2015, trying to start a new institution. You know, what are the barriers?
Yeah, well, I think there's, let me just take a little bit different bet, but I'll answer. But I want to go back to something you just said, and that is that when we talk about innovation, it has to make things better. No one's going to adopt it if it's taking the same thing and just putting it through another channel. So if you think about going back to the original question about MOOCs, right? And 3 years ago, did we think that was going to change the world? We didn't know what it would do. But what we ended up doing is taking something which is a lecture to a large group, which really isn't a very good way to learn. It's a fabulous way to teach. It's easy, right? I can just get up on stage and read my pre-prepared notes. But it's a terrible way to learn. And then we took that and we put it online, which made it more accessible, but didn't make it a good way to learn. So the reason I think you didn't get broad adoption is we didn't improve the learning process.
Well,
go ahead.
Sorry, and the concept is still solid. Like you take, for example, Khan Academy or Code.org, right? It's essentially a MOOC. It's a little bit different, right? The methodology, the mechanism is not the exact same, but the concept is the same of that type of availability. And going back to, you know, what we were talking about ahead of time too, is that if the institution itself is not going to change in the post-Fordist consumer age that we live in, alternatives branch up. Minerva comes out. The computer science high school that I'm a part of, Wasatch Institute of Technology, very, very different model. And in secondary education, those alternatives exist. Whether or not the main established institutions will continue to change and whether there'll be disruption in there, that remains to be seen, but those alternatives come up and we expect them.
So we're at a technology conference, but we're really talking about innovation. And is there that silver bullet of technology that can come out in education, or does it really need to be applied in the right way? Is it something new, or is it something we already have?
I think it's something new. If you think about what technology can enable today in terms of synchronous communication, right? And if you think about what can happen live, if you take something, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with Minerva and the platform we've built, but the idea is to create all small seminars, live, interactive, where students are fully engaged, and engagement has been a word that's come up again and again and again today, because it's critically important. Students have to be involved in the learning process, and then taking that same interaction and tracking it and measuring it and giving feedback and making it so that there's a continuous feedback loop. How many of you went to school and you took a midterm and a final and you got a grade, right? That's very difficult to learn from. We know from the science of learning that continual feedback is a really important mechanism. So we have to think about new technologies that are available today that allow for live, interactive communication, faculty with students, students among students, students sitting all over the world, bringing them together and using the platform to not just learn, but then to track and to monitor success.
But I think you're making a really good point, which is designing technology around learning as opposed to designing technology around teaching.
Exactly.
And we did a lot of designing technology around teaching for a long period of time. And so you get these traditional LMSs that are largely used in traditional institutions to post syllabi for courses. And then
And PowerPoints.
and PowerPoints for the lectures that students don't want to go to at 8 o'clock in the morning. So I think that's the fundamental change, is that if you can create that much more interactive experience, you do get a chance to disrupt.
You know, it's funny, the first university was established in 859 AD in Morocco, curiously enough. And I was reading a treatise that addressed that the biggest disruption that occurred, you know, since that time was the printing press. And the pushback from the schools and universities was that if the students started walking around with books, the value of the university was diminished because there was no longer, you know, the education, because they were going to learn on their own. You know, we're fundamentally doing the same thing today, all right? Innovation, technology, it's a tool, but we're finding reasons why it shouldn't change the institution, not why it should cause the change.
And I guess I have just a slightly different take on this, which is that I think technology has positioned us to transform the institutions by making something possible that wasn't possible before. In particular, with respect to personalized education, we are focused at my institution on adaptive learning. What that does is to make possible a more personalized education for a student. Now, a lot of other things have to go into that, and teachers ultimately are indispensable in the personalization of learning. My favorite quote about higher ed is from a book called The Idea of the University from the 19th century, which is a university should truly be an alma mater, not a foundry, a factory, or a mint. And that is to say, every student is an individual. Ultimately, education takes place best when students' eyes are opened individually, and technology can be a huge assist in that.
Cool. So we have a lot of expertise in this panel in higher education. So I'm kind of curious. I come out of the policy background, as you guys know. There's been a big sort of shift in the last few years, finally, to start to really measure institutions based upon their outcomes. Believe it or not, you know, when I got my start in higher education just 10 years ago, we were funding institutions in Ohio just based on the number of butts and seats on week 3. That's how institutions were awarded. We finally have started to make a lot of progress in outcomes. Now there's been a push on value. What is the value of a degree? What do you guys see in terms of this year, the conversation around the value of a degree and where it's headed? Nathan, let's start with you.
Wonderful. I mean, it's an interesting question. So our challenge at Chegg is beginning to connect enrollment to career. So helping students make the right decision about what school you go to versus making that decision based off the Greek organization, the size of the football team. Your brother went there. I mean, frankly, unfortunately, most students know about, high school students know about the schools within a 50-mile radius of their house. Unless your cousin went somewhere down in Florida, then you're thinking about that school, right? And so we feel that the failure of the university as it has been so far in the degree you get is actually not actually a failure of necessarily the teaching or the academics at that school, but the decision that the student who's going to that school should have never been at that school in the first place, right? Because they're not qualified educationally, academically, to step through those doors. And so to fix the value of degree, right now it's questionable because they're obviously not getting the jobs they need. Teachers don't believe they should teach Excel, but everyone who's hiring an employee today needs that employee to have Excel. So there's obviously a big question in that. But to fix that, you can't fix it way upstream. You can't fix it at the time of gainful employment. You got to fix it back in high school. You got to fix it back with the decisions students are making about where they go to school, when they go to school. I mean, going to a community college for 2 years and then going to a four-year school and actually graduating in 4 years should be seen as a great thing, except if you tell people, oh, my son or daughter is going to a community college, it's seen as a slight on your family. It doesn't make sense anymore.
But it's all about communication and marketing is really what it comes down to, right? Is the students are the consumers, and making sure that you get the right fit. You know,
Absolutely.
You don't I don't wear a size 12 shoe, not even close to it, right? So I'm not going to go to a size 12 university, right? It's making sure that you properly connect the right pieces.
Absolutely.
It's marketing, it's consumerism.
But I think what's implicit in Noah's question, which is important, is that what gets measured gets respected. And if what we're measuring is who's in class in week 3, and we're funding institutions solely on that basis, then that's going to drive a set of behaviors that may or may not. Well, we will get the outcome that we're incentivizing.
Right.
And in that case, we will get lots of enrollment in week 3, and nobody's going to give a crap what happens in week 4. And so if we change the system of measuring and performance, and most important, allocating funding according to that, then I think that's when we'll start to see changes in behavior. The challenge, of course, is it goes back to that question, what's the purpose of the education in the first place? And if you take even a community college student, where you're going to have an incredibly diverse population of students some of whom are there to get a degree. And so it's fair then to assess, are the students earning that degree? Because that's the gate to a potential job change that they're looking for. But there's others who are there because they're a senior citizen who's looking to do something interesting during the day and learn something for personal enlightenment. They're not looking at it from a career standpoint. So do you want to hold the institution accountable because that student didn't earn a degree in 2 years? So I think that is a complicated question, but ultimately we've got to find a way to align the measurement and the incentives with what kinds of behaviors we're trying to create.
In 2013, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released that the high school student, their median weekly salary was $651 a week. A bachelor's degree was roughly $1,100 a week. So depending on what you're measuring, that implies that a bachelor's is obviously far better. A master's degree only brought that up by another $150. So now the question becomes, is that postgraduate of additional value? In Symplicity, what we're trying to do is to help reduce the cost and improve the efficiency of the operating system of the institution. But at the same time, I'm also a high-tech employer, and I have bachelor's students or graduates coming to me. They cannot speak, they cannot write, they are unable to logically present an argument, and they don't understand how to present. So the question then is, so the student looks at it and says, well, at a minimum, I need to have a bachelor's degree. But I'm looking at it and say, and that bachelor's degree does not tell me that you're educated. You are virtually non-employable.
It goes back to what Steve said, that the outcome and measuring and incentivizing the proper outcomes in the proper perspective is critical.
Well, and then it's incumbent upon institutions like Minerva to deliver the kind of skills to help prepare these students to take those jobs. You're going to want our interns, I can tell.
Right. Send them, please.
But I think it's really, really important when we talk about the value of a degree, what does a degree mean? And I think it means very different things. And really, ensuring that a degree means that somebody comes out and can handle the ability to think through a problem, see something that's novel, think about a creative solution. I mean, it's basic skills that then they can approach anything that comes up.
I think, though, that, the question is great. We struggle to answer that question, and really we shouldn't. But I think the reason we struggle so much to answer that is because everybody, on the one hand, the market says, the value of a degree should help you move forward professionally, and institutions ought to be really committed to that goal. At the same time, most folks involved in higher ed don't agree with that entirely. Maybe they will agree with it partially, but for them, higher ed is something more, which harkens back, to the Greeks or the medieval university or the 19th century German university, the way forward, I think, is to find a way for institutions to be more committed to those professional outcomes, because after all, that's why most students are going to school these days. Whether it's 18 to 22-year-olds or adults, the age of going to school to find yourself is really not our age. At the same time, higher ed is about something more than that. Why can't that greater purpose, that greater liberal education serve students moving forward professionally? It ultimately is very important. But there's a lot more involved in professional advancement that institutions could be a lot better at and get a lot better results.
Can technology play a role in shifting that at all?
I think so. I mean, I think it can set the stage for the right kind of discussion. And by doing so, help to unpack deeply varied assumptions about what higher ed is that really need to be examined for there to be the kind of disruption that I think we're talking about.
Yeah. So in order to do that at both the higher ed and K-12 level, you need student data. And that's, and see a lot of smiles. That's something that, in 2014 is obviously became a pretty big issue, both in terms of privacy for students and also in terms of security. We saw data breaches at several large universities. What does the future look like in terms of being able to access and unlock that data in an appropriate manner?
Well, the short-term future is very complicated.
Yeah, I'm scared.
I was going to say, why are we all smiling?
So, I think this is one area where you can have a lot of really well-intentioned people do a lot of really well-intentioned things and make big problems as a result. And so, it's an area where you just have to tread carefully. Although the place that we're going right now is a world where there's 50 different states in the U.S., each enacting their own privacy legislation that's a little bit different. And it creates an incredibly dysfunctional environment in which institutions and students and other stakeholders and companies have to operate. And so, I think there are some things that we can probably all agree on in terms of protecting students from the use of academic data for commercial purposes without consent of students, et cetera. But I think we've got to be very careful about the way some of the legislation gets written. And I have to be honest, over the next 2 to 3 years, I'm not very optimistic. I think there's going to be a lot of knee-jerk reaction to some things that have happened over the last couple of years that could be, at least in the short and medium term, quite detrimental.
And going back to the idea of top-down versus bottom up. There are different ways to gather data rather than just going directly through the schools. There's a lot of problems, there's a lot of issues with it, and people protecting that data and that information. But in how much information do we give to Google? How much information do we give to all of these other institutions outside of education? And we give it freely, wantonly. We give it to them. That's a possibility, I think, in education as well, if we're looking at it differently. Rather than trying to ask permission to come from the top down and do it, that there are alternatives to being able to do
you're talking about on the consumerism side. The students are expecting certain experiences now when they use tools that are trained by folks like Google and Apple and Netflix and all that personalization that happens. And all of a sudden, the school's telling us, well, you can't use that data to give the student a better tutor or a better piece of content for them to learn from. That's going to stifle innovation and unfortunately not force us but make us choose not to go through the institution. So now learning is going to start to happen in all these little islands. And students, if that learning is not connected, then we really can't get a good read on how to put forth the best education for our students.
We're also seeing another unusual behavioral pattern occurring. The student, as you're saying, it's their data. And they should be able to drive where it goes, what it gets used for. The school should not control it by policy. The states should not necessarily be able to legislate how you use it. And the schools, what they're seeing is, the devastation, that has occurred at Walmart and Home Depot. And, the list can go on and on.
University of Maryland.
Yeah, another good example. What they're trying to do now is to turn around to industry and saying, we don't know what to do. We don't know how to protect it. We're going to try and squash as much as we can, but we want you to fully indemnify us in case there's a breach, even if we cause it. That's just not going to fly.
And what's really important about what you just mentioned, that statement you made about the data belongs to the student, that's not a new concept for them. right?
Right.
That's something, that's an expectation that they have. And I think that that's going to bring about change.
So I'm hearing some pessimism in terms of the ability to kind of innovate in the next year. Yet in the first 3 quarters of 2014, there was $1 billion invested in education technology, venture capital. We just heard from a panel of a new education incubator. I mentioned several others as well. Is this something that can take off? There's clearly a lot of investment in the area. Is it ready to go, or are we in a bubble?
I mean, I'm going to say we're not in a bubble because then I'd be part of that bubble, and I don't want to be part of that bubble. So it's not going to happen. Absolutely not going to happen.
But what is going to happen?
I definitely see for 2015, and you're absolutely right, the last 3 years actually, venture capital into features and products that we're going to call small education technology companies has been abundant. And these small companies have been eating the lunch in many cases innovatively of these larger companies. And so I see the 2015 being more of a consolidation time when the larger companies are going to be sucking up some of these smaller products and features, bringing them into, in many cases, the environments they've already built where you can really take a e-portfolio product and thrive inside of the university.
Yeah, so instead of a large company competing with this smaller company, they
Yeah.
bring them in, and then there's a synergy.
Exactly, you got a lot of
So-
synergies there.
I think there's actually some really interesting elements to that touches some of the other questions that we had. So we talked earlier about disruption. I think a lot of companies get started with this notion that they're going to disrupt the entire education system.
And solve world hunger at the same
Solve world
time.
hunger. They come to realize that's actually very, very
And
hard.
make $1 trillion.
And, in a year. And so we see, I don't know, 5, 6 companies a week that are, coming to us and saying, well, we spent that first year trying to disrupt the world, and now we see that you have 10,000 institutions as clients, and we'd really like that sales channel. Can you work with us? I will take a slightly different view than Nathan. I'm not sure we're in a bubble when it comes to innovation. I think that's actually very exciting, the level of innovation that's happening. I do think we're in a bubble in terms of valuation, because I think there's been a whole period where there's just been this inflow of capital, and you've got a lot of people who are doing things that are interesting, but that are not businesses, and that will never have the potential to be self-sustaining enterprises. And we're going to face a day of reckoning on that. And companies like ours, I think, expect that will occur, and that exactly what Nathan describes, a lot of those features will become parts of our products.
Yeah, there's a culling that needs to happen.
Yeah, but I do think that we're at the very beginning. So, a bubble would say that there aren't enough people who are going to care about this. I just even look at this conference and how it's grown year over year, and as the conversation goes, and I think what is happening is those more traditional universities that for a long time thought they could kind of cover their ears and go their own way are now starting to listen, and they're starting to watch more, and I'm sure many people here have had many conversations with them because they're trying to figure it out. And so whether or not, individual startups will stay independent or not, I think there's going to be a tremendous level of adoption and a lot more trial, and I think you're going to see some of the things we learned about over the course of the day today that are happening in small school districts, or one school here, one school there, will start to be adopted broader, and I think that will help to continue the momentum.
Cool. So, in terms of trends that we may see in the next year, what do you guys think of is going to happen in the U.S. versus the international market?
I can tell you one thing that we're seeing as we're, again, selling internationally. In the Middle East right now, I'm finding that because they have a lack of students but plenty of money, they're throwing money at solving their issues. So I'm finding little difficulty selling a lot of technology and a lot of capability into the Middle East. The Indians in the Pacific Rim, the Chinese especially, they are amazing me because they are in fact looking at the entire paradigm. Are they in fact running the right solutions? And some of the questions that they're coming back to us and asking us, to support them on, I can see there is a very significant chance that the subcontinent and Pacific Rim, they could leapfrog as far as a capability is concerned where the West is today. And it's just because they're thinking about it differently, because their commodity is people. and they're trying to figure out how to make that a valuable commodity.
So let's go back for a second to something that we started actually off with Rob, which is going back to the faculty. And at a higher education institution or at a K-12 school, the ultimate guarantor of quality is the faculty member or the teacher. Are they ready to innovate? And Isaac, I actually want to start with you from a K-12 standpoint. Is this something that, when we look back at that some say there was an ed tech bubble, 12, 13 years ago.
Yeah.
Many would probably say it failed because of the institutions and their inability to kind of work with the technology.
Interestingly enough, on the K-12 level, I would say that the educators themselves are ready. They are actually ready for it, and this comes down to educators being able to access content and be able to more effectively teach. They are most definitely ready for that. There's a lot of obstacles that stand in the way, a lot of policy, state laws, those types of things that stand in the way. But just as an example, so the Computer Science High School, the charter school that I'm a part of, very, very unique curriculum. Okay? It's completely 100% project-based. We don't have classes. We have projects. And it's a new concept, but we had an absolutely overwhelming response from educators. I think we have 5 teachers our first year. This is our first year. I think we had between 2,000 and 3,000 people apply to teach at our school. And that's a significant number, and made so that we got some great teachers inside of there. But I think that the educators are actually ready for it. What they're not ready for is the continued stodginess of having to do professional development or having to learn these new types of technologies. They want it to be easy and facilitate what they're doing rather than stand in the way of what they're doing. So that's on the K-12 side.
Well, and I think they're self-identifying. So I wish I could say as optimistically that all faculty were ready to go. I think that there is a small portion that are. And I mean, we're seeing that in applications for faculty as well, and people who are outreaching and saying, I want to start focusing on the students' learning and not just about teaching and not about my research. And so I think you're starting to see that trend happen, and let's hope that it goes more and more that way.
Yeah, I think that's really well stated. And from my point of view, it is the most important thing that needs to happen. Faculty can prevent innovation. Faculty can prevent change to the system. One of the things that's most remarkable is the accreditors, regional accreditors that it's key to getting access to financial aid, have been trying since the early 90s to get institutions to be outcomes focused, right? To maintain your accreditation, you have to give all this evidence that you are oriented toward outcomes at the program level all the way down. What happens routinely at institutions across this country is the year before you go up for accreditation, you fabricate this history of your interest in being outcomes oriented. It goes all across the country. I saw George Q., who's sort of the dean of this whole area from Indiana, talk about this whole effort to have learning outcomes drive institutions, a complete failure, right? Why? Because you could never get faculty to really buy into outcomes, because their vision of what the institution is about is fundamentally different. I do think, though, you hit the nail on the head. Faculty are folks who believe, first and foremost, in their own expertise. They've gone to school for a long time. Their view of their own self-worth is their expertise in a certain subject area. It's very hard to get someone who defines themselves in that way to think about an institution where that was not the defining part of the institution. The opening is, I think, as you pointed out, faculty are also, the best faculty, really passionate about student success, really passionate about students. And those faculty, those who put effective teaching above everything else, are open innovation. And it's a matter of redefining the faculty role such that effective teaching is really what it's all about. That doesn't mean that you can't be a content expert and you can't really value your research, but first and foremost, that's what you've got to be about for the innovative discussion to really get going.
And will technology be able to move forward in this battle for outcomes? Is this something that it can actually help us as we're in this new era of pressure?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, there's more and more technology that's bringing light to data, the data and engagement that's happening in the classroom than ever before. Teachers no longer have to go home and grade 50 papers at night, and they can actually focus on building learning environments and tools that helps kids get over hurdles. And students themselves, finally, for the first time, we were talking earlier, don't just have 3 grades a semester. They've got touch points every single class that they can look at, and they can give signals on themselves on where their performance is located. That's never really happened before. We're finally just getting that.
More communicative, faster, and easier, and that's really what it's about.
Absolutely.
Well, there's one other thing that technology enables, which is, that tying of multiple different courses and tying your curriculum together. So one of the things, if you think about in a traditional university setting, you go to 4 separate classes, and they happen independently, and how you perform in one has nothing to do with the other, and nobody knows where the crossovers are. Now, imagine with a technology platform that enables you to share that among different faculty members, well, one knows exactly what happened in the morning. Hey, they know that was a difficult concept for the student in the morning, so in the afternoon, let's reinforce it. Let's start sharing, and let's actually build a curriculum instead of a bunch of independent classes. Because at the end of the day, a degree is about tying all these pieces together and being able to connect the dots, not just about individual courses.
You just described my high school. Cool. That's exactly what we're doing.
Well, we're getting fairly close to the end, and I want to make sure to save some time for questions and answers. But I do have one last question for each one of you, which is: here we are. It's January. It's 2015. Make one bold prediction that you think is going to happen within the education innovation space this year. And let me ask a kind of a secondary question of: do you think that you can make a bold prediction in 2015? Just to give a quick anecdote, when I worked for the state of Ohio for their Board of Regents, we designed a 10-year strategic plan for higher education, and I was responsible for the accountability metrics. And one of the accountability metrics was a 6-year graduation rate. And here we are doing a 10-year plan. We're not even going to know if we're moving an outcome on an incoming freshman until 6 years in. So we can just go straight down. Bill, you want to start?
That is an easy one. I don't think there's any chance. Until the institutions figure out what their role is and what they are supposed to be delivering, I don't think technology is going to have any impact. So it's not a question of 2015, it's pick a date.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I think there's a lot of there are a lot of assumptions that need to be examined for there to really open the doors to change. But then there's law schools. As I mentioned earlier, all of a sudden, the bottom falls out. If you know higher ed, there is an awful lot of pressure building up behind the dam. And it could be a change that comes very quickly and is very swift and utterly changes the landscape.
I have to agree as well. I mean, 2015, besides seeing, going to be watching the M&A reports for all the consolidation that will happen in aerospace, I can't see technology rapidly changing the education landscape. I do see new business models coming out, a lot of new business models coming out for students themselves, big subscription time for students. The way content was bought traditionally will change. It has been changing. Millions and millions of students are now subscribing to educational services, where before it was an a la carte purchase. You bought it once, you maybe used it once a semester, and now we're really going into a very pure model where students are only paying for what they want when they want to use it. So I see that happening, but nothing wholesale.
Yeah, and I feel like it's cheating a little bit, but let's face it. I mean, education is it's a long game. You don't play this for a year or for 2 years, and there's actually some really good reasons for that, because ultimately this is about something that's going to affect somebody's entire lifetime, and so you want to make sure that the innovations that you adopt are actually going to make a positive difference for students. So I, like everyone else, don't see a dramatic shift in 2015. I do think in the next 2 to 3 years, there's going to be just a ton that happens in this privacy area. As I said, I think in the short term, that's probably largely negative. Ultimately, I think we'll sort of swing back to a position of balance, and so I think that's where we're going to have the greatest impact from a regulatory standpoint over the next several years.
Okay, I'm going to make a bold prediction, and I'm going to put it in the hands of the students, and I'm going to say students are not going to pay for what they can get for free. And if we think about all of the content that's online, if you can take amazing courses from the best professors and watch lecture, why would you go sit in a university, 600 seats, and pay for that? So if we have confidence that students are the consumers and they're not going to pay for what they can get for free, it's going to challenge universities to up their game and to actually improve what that experience is and everything they get out of the university.
Can we pull up that picture? I have a picture to show you. Is it possible?
It's the one with the 2 pictures of the Pope's inauguration. Do you guys have that? It's next slide, I think. Can I do it?
All right, well, as that's
We're
pulling up.
gonna switch it back, so.
It's slide 88.
Yep,
Okay,
it's
right.
coming.
Sorry. Okay, so as that's pulling up, I'll just give a little bit of context, all right? The Industrial Revolution started with Henry Ford, right? And the assembly line, the ability to mass produce things. But Henry Ford made a famous statement, which was, you can have any colored car you want as long as it's black, okay? The post-Fordist industrial era changed us from that way of thinking to consumerism, where we say, you know what, I can have it in yellow, blue, pink, red, orange, whatever. And we've gone into the post-post era, where we say, I know specifically what I want, and I'm going to get that, even if it's not available, I'm going to find somebody to make it for me. So just real quickly, this is 2005, 2013, the Pope inauguration. Okay? David Moss, the director of WIT, my school, uses this slide a lot, and he says that if you have a student entering as a freshman in high school, a change this significant will occur before they graduate from college. According to Moore's law, a change this significant will happen before somebody going into as a freshman in college will graduate from college. A change that significant. Okay? So coming back to, and this is my bold prediction, we've gone from mass producing to mass producing many different things and being flexible to mass producing exactly what we want. I believe that we have come to full circle to the point where we now, instead of want to consume, we want to create. That's why 3D printers are so exploding right now. And that's why David Wadhwani, the senior VP at Adobe, has said, I want people to think of Photoshop the way that they think of Evernote. Right? So my bold prediction is, starting in 2015, that the creation of content, of educational content, by teachers, by students, will become so much easier that everybody will be doing it. It'll be a new source for monetization, a new source for income for those teachers and also for those students, and it will be a differentiator, definitely be a differentiator 5 years from now. That's my
Great.
prediction.
Great. Carrie, I think we have time for questions.
Okay, anyone have a question? Yes. Come in.
You know, I've been watching the Bing polls, you know, on the screen, and it really shows that there's nobody agrees, you know, with anything. You know, it's all over the board. And I can see that in the panels. I actually like very much what Robin said, you know, because in the end, it really is the student that is the customer, and if the student can get the stuff for free, they will. And there's no size that fits all. You know, I work for an R1 university, and if a student wants to get a degree in the sciences, they need to go to an R1 university so they can work in a laboratory with a world-class scientist. But that world-class scientist has to be willing, you know, and it has to be judged that they're going to be providing their time, you know, to a student so that the student gets that enriching experience. Another student who wants to go into business may not need, you know, all the frills of an R1 university. So in the end, it's empowering the students. The other thing I would love to about the international students. One thing I have found by talking to students in Africa, for example, and other places, is that students really see it as a privilege to be in a university. It's not the next step after high school. And so the motivation is also, it's very skewed, you know, when we talk about the United States versus the rest of the world.
And I actually have a follow-on question from that, and I'm kind of curious to get your guys' perspective on this. But, we're talking about students getting something for free and that disrupting it. But in the meantime, tuition fees aren't going down. They're not staying the same. They're going dramatically up. And I mean, student debt's now at well over $1 trillion. I think tuition fees grow, almost 100% over the last 10 years. It's crazy. So is this something that we're actually going to see a shift in cost start to happen?
Probably, right, in some ways, but I think Robin's point is absolutely on, that students aren't going to pay for something that they can get for free, but then we've got to go back to what is it that they're getting?
Yeah.
And if it were just learning, how to do calculus, sure, they could do that for free. But a lot of them are going through the motions of learning calculus in an environment that they're paying to be in because they're actually paying for something else that came along with it.
Right.
Which is either the degree, or maybe it was the social experience that they had. I mean, I think we have to be honest about the reasons why a lot of students are in school. It's a varied set of reasons. And so you may not see as dramatic a shift as you might expect to see if you were purely looking at what students could do online from a learning perspective for free.
And the other part of that, sorry, real quick, Robin, is subsidizing of it, right? Because they're going into debt, they're going into $250,000 in debt, and they pay for that later. So when you're a consumer and you're paying out of your own pocket, it makes a big difference, I think.
Students are also voting with their feet, and I don't have the numbers immediately available, so I won't quote them, but look at how the number of students going to the United Kingdom has increased, because you get a 4-year degree for a fraction of what it costs here in the U.S., and the numbers have been going up annually. So the students are telling us it's too expensive.
Well, and look, you can build new models where tuitions are less. And so we haven't talked about tuition. Tuition at Minerva is $10,000 a year, 25% of what it would be at another American private institution. And how can you do that? You have to rethink the model completely. So instead of building climbing walls and the next big stadium and the art exhibition hall and the better cafeteria, we have amazing cities around this world that have everything to offer, and the students can have an amazing immersive experience with their community of students in these cities. And so it's not even just trying to, change something mildly, but really rethinking the whole paradigm of what the university experience should be, and the students should pay for value.
Right.
That's the big thing, right? They should pay for what they're getting out of it, not for research or basketball or anything else.
Some of us went to Ohio State and got what we paid for.
To Ohio State, you mean the Ohio State?
The Ohio State.
The Ohio State.
Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Sean Walkenhorst from Intel Corporation, and you said before that why should a student, pay for something that they can get for free, and I agree that someone highly motivated could probably get a better education going through the motions on their own, but to a corporation, are they going to trust that? Yeah. Employability, the degree is a prerequisite to the interview. So while I agree that there might be the opportunity to get the education, and maybe somebody like yourself, where you said you'd had some bad experiences getting somebody, maybe you'd consider someone who is, self-educated, can demonstrate that to you through an interview or something like that. But I'd say that most jobs would not.
In fact, I'm hiring more off hackathons now than I am relying upon a 4-year degree.
And I'll take a little contrarian view. I worked for eBay for 11 years. Okay? I actually own a patent with eBay, and I've worked for Adobe for 5 years. I got my degree last year. I received my degree from last year, and it was from Western Governors University, right? So yes, that is important, but what's more important is the way that the models are changing, like you said, the hiring from hackathons, and there are traditional institutions that do require that. That's absolutely true, and there's a place for that, right? But there's also a place for everything, right? Let's all hold hands and kumbaya, but that's really what it comes down to, is that if a student is not getting what they need for whatever their individual growth is from a university, they're going to go try to find another university or another institution or another way to do it. If they don't find it there, then they'll do it on their own.
At the same time, though, I don't think access is the problem anymore, and hasn't been for some time. I mean, access has increased for students of all kinds of different groups tremendously, and with the with the internet revolution and so forth, students have more access. But the real challenge is the completion, the success of students, and the way in which the current model just does not bring about high percentages of success. I mean, the graduation rates at a lot of institutions in this country are incredibly low. The graduation rates for underserved or underrepresented groups are really low. There's this phrase, I mentioned it earlier in our group, it's big in the academic administration world, access is not enough. It's by this Vincent Tinto, who really studies this sort of stuff, and his point is, it's not enough just to admit students to increase access. You have to change the way these institutions work so you have more success. That's, to me, what it boils down to, and to really be open to changing the model is a very deep conversation that most institutions are nowhere close to having.
I think we're forgetting one piece, though. I mean, so I agree, access is widely available now for a number of learning resources. What we haven't talked about is changing HR behavior and how people actually hire. And that goes to the point of your question. Yes, you can have hackathons. Yes, you can prove that you can code. Yes, you can prove that you can be a data scientist. But there's a plethora of careers out there that really, without a degree, you're not going to get into accounting. You're not going to get into marketing unless HR changes their beliefs on how they're going to hire candidates.
That sounds like a great panel for next year.
Right, there we go.
Great. Noah, you want to wrap us up? I think we're at the end here.
Yeah, no, I just thank you to the panelists. This was really terrific, and I think you guys are all able to take some more questions if people want to hang around, I think. But yeah, thank you, Carrie. Anything you want to conclude with?
Yep. I'll come up there, Noah. Thank you all very much. Thanks to our panelists for wrapping up the day.